What even is a spiritual successor anyway? I got this question more or less from a viewer of my first impressions video talking about Terra Memoria, a game that to my eye bears a striking resemblance to Breath of Fire. I got similar questions from viewers in my JRPG Weekly Update video featuring the upcoming 45 Parabellum, which I called a Parasite Eve successor in the title, and again in my first impressions video of Sky Oceans, which a lot of other YouTubers compared to Skies of Arcadia. And of course games like Sea of Stars and Chained Echoes got all kinds of comparisons to Chrono Trigger, and I don't see any signs of that behavior slowing down. Generally speaking, we use words to convey ideas and meanings. What a revelation, right? But when it takes too many words to say something, we like to find shortcuts.
Why waste time? Say lot word when few word do trick.
Sometimes we invent new words for the task, and other times we repurpose existing words. So at a certain point, if you want to say that one game is like another game without describing the real-time combat featuring an emphasis on well-timed button presses to dodge, parry, and block incoming enemy attacks, and also an emphasis on death and recovery from death, and featuring a dark and broody atmosphere, you could say that that game is like a Souls game. Souls-like, if you will. But what happens when it's harder to nail down what mechanics specifically makes a game a Chrono-like? If those gameplay mechanics or storyline features aren't exclusive to the Chrono series? What if those are simply stylistic leanings? What if people are inspired by the game and want to try their hand at making a similar feeling title? What if the original developers break away from the IP owner and want to make a sequel all their own? Is Xenoblade a spiritual successor to Xenosaga and Xenogears? These kinds of terms feel relatively new and language is a little fuzzy. As time goes on, I'm sure that some of these terms will continue to solidify or change and evolve, but for the time being, we're still solidifying what those terms mean, and when to use them, and how to use them. The term first showed up in Google Trends back in January of 2012, and has quickly become more and more popular as a search term ever since. In 2017, author James Kozanitis, I hope I'm saying that right, of GameRevolution.com wrote an article stating that the term spiritual successor has lost its meaning. Well, I guess it was a good 5 years while it lasted. I think it's kind of difficult to nail down what these are meant to mean beyond something like, I want to make a sequel to this game, but I don't own the intellectual property rights. I think Xenogears to Xenosaga to Xenoblade is about the purest representation of the idea of a spiritual successor as we can get, where we have some of the original development staff behind said game coming together to make the new game. Or like Kodelka's staff to Shadow Hearts to the upcoming Penny Blood, or Wild Arms to the upcoming Armed Fantasia. Now, Yasunori Mitsuda was involved in the music of Sea of Stars, which has been called a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger. Does that count? Probably not in the purest of interpretations, since we often care more about the gameplay and story when it comes to this sort of thing as opposed to the music, but you can see how it pretty quickly starts to become fuzzy. It also feels like oftentimes a game developer cannot deem themselves to be making a spiritual successor if they were not involved in the original at least. Sometimes people external to the development might refer to them that way, as many have referred to Sea of Stars and Chained Echoes as spiritual successors. I don't think either studio ever christened their own game as such though. That would seem a bit too lofty. So instead, a lot of the developers will state their inspirations instead, inspired by classics like Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG, and Grandia. I think that there are a few reasons for this, and one of those reasons is to, again, convey information. The developers want potential players to know what they were aiming for. This is pretty important because if I like those games, I might have a greater appreciation for games that were inspired by them too. Another side effect is probably incidental in most cases, but people were probably searching for Chrono Trigger and games like Chrono Trigger a lot more than for Chained Echoes in the early days of Chained Echoes' existence. Associating your game with the title of a more popular game won't always help, but it can have a small splash effect of search engine optimization. So it was clickbait. I knew it! Well, not so fast. Let's remember first and foremost that the reason we collectively hate clickbait in the first place is primarily because of the prevalence of bait and switch content on YouTube back in the good old days so many of you seem fond of. Click on a thumbnail with boobs in it only to get rickrolled? No, that's a bait and switch bait. And people used to do it all the time to game the system of YouTube to get a bunch of views. Now though, people tend to throw the term clickbait around for anything attention-grabbing or raising curiosity. But let's be real, the actual problem of clickbait is broken promises that we now associate with clickbait. If a video or video game fulfills the promises that they make, is that still clickbait? Or is that just good marketing? What do you think? And finally, what about YouTubers like me who talk about these games? In the past, I've tried to walk the tightrope of setting accurate expectations in titles and thumbnails of my videos while making it easier to attract views from the game's future fans. My title for this video about Terra Memoria was "This Gorgeous Indie is not Breath of Fire, but play it." This simultaneously told you a few key important things. 1, it's an indie. It's beautiful, it's good, and it's not Breath of Fire. But why is that last one so important? Because now you know that it's not Breath of Fire. But also, maybe it is? Why else would I draw that comparison? That's a lot to convey in under 50 characters, which is tricky as heck to work with, by the way. But other times, I talked about 45 Parabellum and I called it a Parasite Eve successor in the title. The developer of 45 Parabellum did not call itself a spiritual successor, but did mention that the combat was inspired by Parasite Eve. Visually, it's also very similar in its low poly, low resolution PlayStation 1 aesthetic. So what's going on here? Well, I mentioned in the comments of that video that if you think it's hard to convey nuance on Twitter, wait until you have to write headlines. 45 Parabellum is an exciting indie that I believe Parasite Eve fans will adore. So to get their attention, I included Parasite Eve in the headline and had to be as concise as possible. It was a gamble, but one that appears to have mostly paid off in the sentiment that I'm seeing in the comments. The promise of a Parasite Eve successor, as opposed to a sequel, was fulfilled enough that people weren't as disappointed by what they found. And with that as my guide, I was able to bring a lot of attention to 45 Parabellum, and some fans of Parasite Eve found out about my JRPG news series, the JRPG Weekly Update, and they subscribed. A mutually beneficial exchange for all involved, in my estimation. So, does this mean that I'm allowed to play fast and loose with these terms? Not really, no. Had I received negative feedback, I'd have probably changed the title to something else, and I would have learned something from the experience. So my pledge has always been to do my best to fulfill the promises that I make in the title and thumbnails, and to tell you about the games that I'm excited about in ways that'll help get you hyped responsibly. When I use certain words and phrases, it's to efficiently convey specific meanings, and if any nuance is left on the table by a headline, I'll be sure to include that nuance in the content of the video. And if you enjoy this kind of introspective video essay, you might want to check out my video exploring what the term RPG even means, and explore the spectrum of RPG-ness. I even wear a suit and tie in that one, so check it out. And I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, everyone.